This video today is all about love. We're going to redefine it today and we're going to set it in its own new category. The best thing to do to get started, though, is first go to rednotesone.org and scroll down to your Series 1 videos to the Marriage Basics and to click on that tab and download your Marriage Basics pamphlet. The idea here is that you can read through this information after you listen to this video. There's discussion questions that I want you to go through with your spouse and really have a good conversation about what love has looked like in your own marriage and how we're going to go about redefining that today. So the first thing I want to say here is our first principle is love is a choice, not just a feeling. Now, for some of you, you may never have heard that before. You're thinking, well, that sounds terribly unromantic. What do you mean that love is a choice? Well, surely in your marriage, you've realized that there are plenty of moments where you struggle to feel love for your spouse. And so that's where the choosing part of love comes into play. That love is also about choosing to love in the moments that we don't want to love or we don't feel like loving. Our inspiration comes from Ephesians chapter 5, where it talks about how Jesus, in his selfless sacrificial love for his people, died on a cross for us. And so we need to take that inspiration of how Christ loved us into our marriages. And so you might be saying, well, that's a nice sentiment, but what does that mean practically to love my wife or my husband as Christ loved the church? Well, we highlight 4 main ways that you can go about starting to choose love in some main areas of your relationship. The first being to set your spouse apart from even your parents. Now, for some of you, you may have some struggles with the in-laws. So it's important for you to realize that in your marriage, you need to choose to say that our marital relationship, our little family, is separate from either of our family of origin. So our parents may have expectations of us, our siblings, whatever, but we need to make sure that we set our marriage apart from even our own family and say, we are our own family now, and we set the expectations and the boundaries, and everybody else needs to fall in line. Now, there's some discussion questions that you can go through to kind of evaluate that for yourselves. The second area is to set your spouse apart from your kids. For those of you that are parents, it's so important to remember that even though you're active in parenting, that doesn't mean you forget about the marriage, because oftentimes what happens is you raise your kids and 20 years later, all of a sudden you look at each other and you say, oh, I remember you back in the early years when we were married before kids. Don't forget to spend time together to build into your marriage. That's so important to be active in your marriage aside from just being parents. In the third sense, you want to set your spouse apart from other men and women in your life. Make sure that you don't have relationships with coworkers or with friends, that you bond with them in a way that you should be bonding with your spouse. Let me make the footnote of Facebook. Be careful with Facebook and what that opens the door of possibility and connection with other people. Make sure that you guys talk about appropriate boundaries of how you interface with the opposite sex. And lastly, the biggest challenge is setting your spouse apart from even yourself. It's so important to recognize that the selfless sacrificial love that Christ showed us, we need to have toward our spouse. We need to look at each other and say, your needs are more important even than my own. Now, there's plenty of information with which for you to read through, but there is some homework that the 5 love languages is such an important, great concept that kind of helps to practice this idea of choosing to love your spouse even over yourself. I encourage you to go online to the5lovelanguages.com and take a brief survey to find out what your love language is and understand that loving your spouse the way they need to be loved is so important. So I hope you join me in the next video regarding trust.